My name is Manuel Roman Lacayo. I am the Associate Director for the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome to another Charlemos event. Today's event is Public Responses to Undemocratic Incumbents with Matthew Singer and Amy Erica Smith, moderated by Andres Mejia Acosta. I will take full responsibility for all the technical challenges we've faced up until now, but fortunately it's still early in the hour, and hopefully you all still have the same amount of time to listen to these wonderful conversations. So without further ado, Andres Mejia Acosta.
Gracias, Manuel, and good afternoon, good evening for some, and welcome to the last 2022 edition of Charlemos. We have two fascinating papers today by Matt Singer and Amy Erica Smith. The panel name is Public Responses to Undemocratic Incumbents, and Matt will be, he comes from University of Connecticut, and we will be talking about his paper on Perspective on Politics, Fiddling While Democracy Burns. Partisan Reactions to Weak Democracy in Latin America. Amy Erica Smith comes from Iowa State University, and she has written a fantastic piece with Molly Cohen, Mason Mosley, and Matthew Layton, Winners Consent, Citizen Commitment to Democracy when Illiberal Candidates Win Elections, out in AJPS. These are two fascinating papers asking a relatively unexplored yet increasingly common concern. How do voters and elites react when their illiberal candidates, or electoral authoritarians as they are called, win elections? Do they moderate and exert some forbearance, or do they double down and turn a blind eye on irregularities, and even worse, ignore deterioration of democratic institutions, thus paving the road to further adoption of illiberal practices? They both use survey data to ask citizen and elite attitudes about their candidates, in the case of Amy Erica's paper, and trust in democratic performance and the democratic process in the case of Matt's work. As we will discuss today, the research findings have substantive implications for defending or deepening the democratic crisis across the region, but it is also becoming growingly relevant to pose some questions about elections and commitment to democracy in the US. Good afternoon, everyone. And Amy Erica, your research finds that Bolsonaro's victory in Brazil narrowed the winner-loser support gap for the democratic system, but the tolerance gap for undemocratic actions between winners and losers actually widened. Is there a contradiction or inconsistency in this finding? And why do you think it's important to make this distinction in the first place? Good afternoon and welcome to Charlemos.
Thank you so much, Andres, for the great question. Is there a contradiction? So I would say that yes, on the surface, yes, there does appear to be a contradiction. But the basic problem here, the key to understanding this is understanding the real sort of ambiguities and questions wrapped up in what people mean when they talk about support for democracy in the abstract. So survey questions have long been asking citizens, to what extent do you support democracy in the abstract? The question that's typically used is what we call a Churchillian question, which is based on a modified version of a statement from Winston Churchill. The statement on surveys is to what extent do you agree or disagree on a 7-point scale, with the statement that democracy may have problems, but it's better than any other form of government. So citizens all across North and South America respond to this question on a 7-point scale, on a regular basis on questionnaires like the Americas Barometer or the Latino Barometer, many other questionnaires like the World Values Survey. But there's real questions and ambiguities about what it means. And citizens are often able to say that they support democracy in the abstract while not having real commitment, what we in our paper call democratic commitment, which is willingness to stand up for democracy even when it conflicts with other personal goals. So in this case, people found to say that they like democracy somewhat more after winning an election. Both winners and losers, in Bolsonaro's case, come to say that they like democracy somewhat more in this abstract Churchillian question. But Bolsonaro's supporters also become increasingly supportive of blatantly undemocratic actions by Bolsonaro once Bolsonaro has won.
Great. Thank you, Amy. And let me turn over to Matt. Welcome to Charlemos. Why do you think it's relevant that elites and voters publicly acknowledge that erosions in the democratic process are taking place? And perhaps more importantly, how do you interpret their silence or their failure to criticize about democratic deterioration as a future threat for democratic stability?
Yeah, so my paper and Amy Erica's paper are both interested in this. What does it take to get people to acknowledge that their side's breaking the rules? And we kind of just keep hoping that as I've been thinking about this question, because you were nice enough to say I was going to get it, I just kept thinking, man, I'm just so naive. But I just have this naive hope that, someone's going to stand up for the IFE in Mexico. That's not the opposition. That somebody is going to stand up, for the free press whenever it's being attacked in various countries. That's not just the opposition. And so, if it's all just opposition based, I worry about that danger that then society polarizes on the question about whether or not democracy is just a partisan football or not. And then instead of it being like this thing that we all agree on. And so like Amy Erica's and colleagues' results show, and I've shown in other things, whenever we start getting winners who are willing to justify all kinds of undemocratic actions, it's dangerous, I feel like. And that's the worry, that then the leader feels like they have a base to do whatever they want. And so my paper was just saying, look, can we at least get them to acknowledge that elections in your country are less trustworthy? Can we get them to acknowledge that maybe I'm not quite as satisfied with democracy if I'm in a country that's undemocratic compared to one that's very democratic? And well, the good news is the losers can acknowledge that the election they lost was actually clean and reasonably good in the country. Well, they're more likely to, at least in the countries that are democratic or more democratic. The winners don't seem to acknowledge any kind of democratic weakening at all in their basic descriptions of it. And so I just think that's just dangerous and creates that space for, winners to then tempt their luck and to see, okay, if my guys will sign off on this, what else will they sign off on?
And the interesting thing is that you are comparing both their attitudes towards a more objective or neutral dimension of democracy. So it does become indeed this partisan football that you talk about, that democracy becomes politicized in itself. How do your measures look at and measure this gap towards this central or neutral understanding of democracy?
So my measures, it's the pretty standard democratic satisfaction question. We've got the trust in elections question, and then the trust in electoral agency. And then the other thing that I like about this paper is I'm able to use both parliamentary elite data and mass data from the Latin American Public Opinion Project. So I initially started on the paper way too many years ago with just the elite data, and had an R&R at a really good journal where they said, well, it's not really clear what exactly your story is. And I said, yeah, you're right. And so it sat for a long time until after I wrote my comparative political studies piece, about, the problem with winners. And then I got thinking, oh, what would that look like on just these basic descriptive questions? Do they see it, or will they at least acknowledge it? And so that's the data I looked at.
Exactly. Thanks, Matt. And Amy Erica, your paper is actually called Winner's Consent. And your work finds that support for institutional ruptures remain high among Bolsonaro voters after the inauguration, but also the support for anti-system attitudes. So that stayed high, the support for anti-system attitudes. Do you envision that there could be a vicious circle by which emboldened authoritarians interpret this political mandate to undermine institutions and ensure that the losing side never wins again, as we recently heard in the last week, actually? And if you can comment a little bit about Latin American elections, because they seem to offer sort of a mixed basket with the obvious cases of Venezuela and Nicaragua, with emboldened authoritarians strengthening further their position. But we also have some important reversals from liberal incumbents in Brazil and Ecuador. What do you think is at play?
Yeah. Okay, thank you for the question. It's a good question. Yes, I agree that there is a potential vicious circle here, and that we have seen it in some cases. Illiberal incumbents are able to undermine democracy in many cases. In the Brazilian case, we see the illiberal incumbent losing ultimately in the end. And it appears from what, I mean, the illiberal incumbent came very, very close to winning. I mean, he was, 49.2% of the vote or so is, it's really, really close. Lula just skated in with one of the narrowest margins ever in a second round victory. But in the end, Lula did come through. So does this mean that the vicious circle didn't happen in Brazil? I would say that it did happen among a share of the electorate. Public opinion data seems to support that strongly, but not in a sufficient slice of the electorate to get him a victory in the end. And I think that one of the things that happened, well, there are lots of things that coincided all at once to lead to Bolsonaro's loss in 2022. From a democratic perspective, the most interesting thing that happened is support for democracy on the part of elites themselves. So it wasn't unanimous support for democracy on the part of elites and portrayal of Bolsonarismo. There were supporters of Bolsonarismo at the elite level, and yet at the elite level, most office holders came through as supportive of democracy and as rejecting coups in the end. And this elite level support for democracy came out as really quite robust, and I think was ultimately a big part of what helped to save Brazilian democracy and helped to provide sufficient support for democracy at the mass level that the system was ultimately able to reject Bolsonaro.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Matt, perhaps a question around whether you think the students of electoral politics and democracy ought to be turning their attention to this wave of electoral authoritarian dynamics, perhaps as a regular field of study. And would you agree with Amy Erica's paper and argument that eroding support for democracy creates a reservoir of support for future violations? Or do you believe this trend can be reversed?
Yeah, so thankfully there's a lot of really great work being done on electoral authoritarian regimes, and now finally I think public opinion work starting to catch up on that. The big challenge being, of course, doing polls in these places is really hard, and then trying to manipulate things in the right way and get an experiment that can tap into it in the right way is really key. I mean, that's what's so nice about Amy Erica and colleagues' work. I mean, is able to get that quite bit to frame out and not have to be waiting for the universe to provide a bad case for them. So I think one thing that's interesting about this reservoir of support is I was thinking as America was speaking about, and I was struck watching the Brazilian elections at how that we didn't get the worst case scenario. And I think America is exactly right, that we had significant elites who stepped in and said, okay, the election happened, you lost, and let's move on. And as she was talking, I was thinking, American elites on the right were really, really pro-democratic on January 6th at night and January 7th. And that's my big worry, is that they pivoted. I mean, we can think about the statements that were made by prominent people who have backed Trump since. And, we could see that across cases where it's really easy to kind of criticize things in the moment, but then if the leader stays in power, often they still fall back in line. And I think because there's this reservoir of support and people's partisan interests make them stay home with their party regardless of what they do, that ends up being very dangerous. And I think we have to worry about how polarization and other factors are causing people to just be fairly uncritical and accepting the things their side does and the things their side claims about how the system works.
Certainly, when I was still doing my comms, there was this very firm difference between comparative and American politics, and that line is becoming more and more blurred. And we seem to have at hand a literature that's coming from Latin America on elections and democratic erosions that is becoming ever so relevant to understand US politics. This is a question for you both. Would you say that the limited losses of Democrats in the midterm elections last week could be interpreted as a sign of forbearance on the part of voters by electing less radical candidates? Or do you expect actually conditions for greater toleration or forbearance in the 2024 presidential elections? I'm sorry, I had to throw this inevitable so what for US politics question.
I wasn't sure if America or I were going to get the floor.
Who would like to go first?
America, go.
Yeah. The secret, Matt's little scarcely hidden secret is that he doesn't want to answer this question, and neither do I. Is the outcome of the US 2024 election a result of forbearance? So I don't think that this is exactly what political scientists would call forbearance, either what Alicia Holland, who's here on this call as a panelist, would call forbearance, or what I think we.
I was thinking more on the Levitsky-Ziblatt distinction of conditions for to prevent erosion, further erosions of democracy.
Yeah, so I think in the Levitsky and the Ziblatt formulation, forbearance would be a characteristic of elites. Though it could, I guess, also apply to the masses. I don't think this is people refusing to use the full scope of their powers just because they feel committed to being nice to each other. I don't think that's what's happening in the US midterm elections. And I'm not a pundit on American politics, and I try to avoid punditizing on American politics, but I don't have a sense that what happened in the US 2024 elections is about people refusing to use the full scope of their powers. I do think that it is somehow related to this notions of democratic attitudes. I think that that there was some level of rejection at the level of public opinion, that there was some sliver of the electorate that rejected anti-democratic maneuvers, and that sliver of the electorate was sufficiently large to give some unexpected races to the Democrats in this case. And I think that the kinds of maneuvers that tend to be perceived as overtly anti-democratic are precisely the kinds of ones that they're big, blatant maneuvers. So subtle erosion of democracy through gradual changing of the rules tends to be really hard for the average person to understand as being anti-democratic. But what we have seen in the US in recent years is big, blatant, showy kinds of democratic erosions. And I think that there is a sliver of the electorate that was sufficient, that was turned off by this kind of behavior in the United States to give some unexpected raises to Democrats in 2022.
Right.
And I like that
Andrew.
word sliver
Right.
that Erica said. I mean, again, most people stayed home. I mean, I stayed home, like, not in terms of not turning out. Most people stayed with their party. And I think she's absolutely right that what turns off the electorate are the big showy things.
Mhm.
And, you know, that you have to worry about big showy things backfiring, but you can get away with all kinds of small stuff, all kinds of manipulations, and, you know, gradual weakening of the press, and nobody notices. Or the press is so demonized, you see this so biased against your side that you kind of even might subtly applaud it. And when there's such a societal distrust, I really worry about that. And so, you know, we see that in Latin America. You know, I just get worried about the levels of distrust of parties, the levels of distrust of press, the level of distrust of institutions. And part of that distrust is rightfully earned by institutions that haven't been fully responsive or representative of various groups. But then the opportunities that creates for leaders just to subtly undermine them in ways that over time, if you add them up, seem to stack the deck. And so I think we see that, and we have to hope that there's a sliver of the electorate that can notice. And I worry about the level of engagement that takes and the level of being able to get beyond your cognitive blinders on what your side needs to be able to do that.
Great. Thank
Yeah, I
you.
would say actually, I'm sorry.
Go on.
If I can add really quickly, I think that the metaphor of democratic erosion is useful. If we think about it, I think erosion is much more effective when it is slow erosion. And sudden falling of boulders just is a lot harder for people to put up with and easier for them to recognize, where slow erosion is the kind of thing that happens. I'm just reading right now about protests against AMLO's changes to the electoral authority, to the National Electoral Institute in Mexico. Those are the kinds of things that people protest against. And when they're big, showy changes, when they're little things, it becomes much easier to erode democracy. And I think that what we've seen in the US in recent weeks is a reaction against the big things.
Great. Thank you. I am just typing a note to the audience, inviting you to write down your questions for the panelists, Matt or Amy, Erica, briefly identifying yourselves by name and affiliation. Perhaps we can collect a few questions and open this second part of the debate with a more free-flowing conversation.
As the questions come in, I will note back to your point about how it seems like comparativists get to increasingly speak to the US. And I will say the reviewers are pretty explicit on that in my paper. Like they were pushing me to try and in the conclusion make that connection more and more explicit. And so there's a short-term marketplace there that makes me sad for the world that's necessary. But as we're talking about research process, those opportunities to make those connections seem to be increasingly there.
I was curious about that link because that was something, that was a bridge that was not necessarily needed to be crossed, or if anything, it was sort of what can Latin American politics learn from what American politics have done in terms of models and literature. But now we're observing a bit of the reverse. And I was wondering if editors are also becoming more demanding in that sense of making more explicit connections back to the US case. Do we have any questions from the panel? We normally encourage people to write down their questions. We have Scott Morgenstern. Matt had been talking about the trust in institutions. Well, Amy Erica is talking about the Churchillian question. Is there a significant difference in studying the themes in this way? Perhaps, Scott, you may want to turn on your microphone if you want to further elaborate on this. Yeah,
Sure.
brilliant.
I mean, you got the first part of it. And the second part of that I was going to ask and didn't write it down yet is that I think in some countries, say, Venezuela or perhaps even Bolsonaro, Brazil, that the authoritarian leaders talk about democracy as if they embody democracy. It's the vertical democracy without the horizontal aspects of democracy. And as such, voters may, I don't know, maybe get confused. Who is the Democrat? Trump certainly talks about he's the embodiment of democracy. And so, the trust question, I think, is very different once you take that into context of what the leaders are saying about their own regimes. So I wondered if the two of you could comment on how you view this question.
Would either of you want to respond?
I can take it. So the question about the differences between all of these many different measures of democracy. So my paper actually ends up using 4 or 5, depending on the moment and analysis, dependent variables, which collectively we end up calling democratic commitment as sort of a hook to hang all of these different concepts on. And none of them are actually, I think, the measure. You're using satisfaction with democracy, right, Matt? Do I recall?
Yes, I've got that, and I've got trust in elections, trust in the electoral agency.
Oh,
So
that's
mine's
right,
much
yes.
more specific support.
Yes. And then, yeah, so none of ours are exactly the same questions that Matt uses. I can talk about the relationship among all of these different kinds of questions. Churchillian democracy is, in general, sort of the most kind of valent, everybody likes, or everybody is supposed to like it, social desirability bias to, to strongly supporting it, of the kinds of questions. And this is why we don't stick only with support for democracy, because we are somewhat skeptical ourselves about what it actually signifies in terms of citizens' perceptions and commitments to their regime. In addition to support for democracy, we also use a measure of system support, which gets, I think, at a conceptual level, somewhat closer to the notion of satisfaction. We have nerdy time talking about the differences between system support and satisfaction with democracy, but I think that there are some conceptual links between the measure, the measure that the Americas Barometer that LAPOP has developed. It's a 5-question battery about to what extent do you think that, for instance, that basically that the institutions in your society are basically free and fair. So 5 different questions, we take the mean of them to get this index of system support. And this does get closer to the idea of, belief that elections are free and fair, though belief that elections are free and fair is even more specific and targeted. And it is somewhat close to the idea of satisfaction with democracy, though these are different measures, but they are conceptually linked. And then in addition, in our paper, we also use measures of support for coups under various circumstances and support for other kinds of institutional closures or institutional ruptures that are overtly anti-democratic by all of our conceptualizations of what democracy is. So yeah, we're looking at a whole bunch of different things. We find movement in similar kinds of ways in many of the measures, but we do find that support for specific institutional ruptures that would benefit Bolsonaro actually goes up among Bolsonaro supporters after his victory. So people become somewhat more satisfied with their institutions, slightly more supportive of democracy in a very small way, but also that is his supporters, but also become much more willing to endorse ruptures that would benefit him. I'm not sure if that's fully answering your question. It's just me rambling a lot, Scott.
So yeah, I'd chime in with the same thing where I mean, these indicators are designed to tap into such different things. And so like in my 2018 article, you know, winners said that democracy was the best system, said they were satisfied with democracy, and then rejected all kinds of military coups. And then, as America is saying in Brazil, and their experimental evidence shows really nicely, become very willing to endorse all kinds of undemocratic actions that help their side. And so these are different kind of dimensions in how people are thinking about it. And so in my case, for example, the Churchillian question, I love it. I think it does all kinds of good things and tells us a lot about kind of support for the democratic status quo. But it didn't get at what I was interested in here on, you know, how do they see the system in its moment? I mean, you know, ideally, you can be hopefully, ideally we'd be in, you know, or let me rephrase, ideally we could be in a Pippa Norris world where people have really high expectations for democracy, believe in it heavily, and are unsatisfied with things, and that's okay. I mean, the ideal world, obviously, is we have high expectations for democracy and we're happy with it, but, you know, and so I think that's one of these things here where I think we have to be very careful in choosing our indicators to measure different things and to think about what the implications are for the distribution of power. And as you mentioned, Scott, in your second question, the big challenge here is that populists frequently frame their actions as being democracy enhancing. And, you know, we see that, and again, I'm willing to say some of them might be, you know, I mean, bringing their majoritarian democracy enhancing, and some of the institutions that were under attack and that populists replaced and undermined, we might say we're broken and we're not providing meaningful representation to a lot of people. And so but you're right that didn't just create the challenge of, you know, trying to decide if Hugo Chavez is a Democrat or not. And depending upon your definition, you can then make different cases for it. And all of us who are old, and remember when Chavez, the first decade of his rule, being at LASA panels or APSA panels where that was actively debated. And, you know, and similarly for lots of the leaders of the populist left that we worried about for some of these checks and balances in liberal democracy, you know, we remember these debates because they're framing it in democratic ways. And so that's what's really hard. And some of these questions, you have to design more specific questions and more specific interventions like America and her colleagues have done.
I think it's quite interesting to something you inserted, Matt, in your work about the majority staying silent and not acting upon their, say, discontent or disregard of democratic erosion. And thinking back to the Chavez question, a good part of the elites, the critical elites, would have stayed silent and not actively protest or move against that, which can create in longer term, sort of an endorsement effect, sort of allowing these authoritarians to push through their reforms later on. I have a question from Clemens Singer for Amy. And it says, you spoke of elites. Who are they? Generals, wealthy people, and how do they actually use their influence?
Need to unmute myself. Yeah, so Clemens, when I used the term elites, I was mostly talking about political elites. I was also, though, referring to the military. So there's a lot of research on the importance of support for democracy at the level of elites. And in the Brazilian case, we have a situation in which the political class seems to overall, cross like the wide range of people who, who get involved in elections. So we're talking everywhere from, local politics all the way up to national level politics. There seems to be pretty widespread endorsement among the players in the political game of the rules of the political game, which means that Bolsonaro has been an outlier within the political class in his tendency to flout the rules. And he has brought some people to his side. But I think what's notable about the Brazilian context is how relatively few people he has brought to his side. I mean, he has certainly brought people to his side, but we don't see a widespread co-optation of a large sector of the political right even. And I think this is in part about the extreme fragmentation of Brazilian politics. The extreme fragmentation of Brazilian politics has actually, in the end, helped to preserve this famous, it's famously fragmented, which has all kinds of political dysfunction, but ultimately it has helped to preserve Brazilian democracy. I was at a panel there at Pittsburgh just over a month ago or so for Barry Ames, recognizing Barry Ames's retirement. And we had this discussion about how the deadlock of democracy, ironically, maybe maybe not a deadlock, but something that actually ultimately helps to save Brazilian democracy. I would also, though, so when I was speaking, I was thinking about politicians, but I would also say that the military certainly deserves mention here. Bolsonaro comes out of the military, thinks of his base as being the military, certainly has plenty of support in among like ordinary or ordinary members of the armed services. And also one of the things that's been notable about Bolsonaro's experience in office is how little overall he has ultimately been able to corrupt and co-opt the military. There are plenty of problems. But ultimately, when push came to shove, there was not support for anything approaching a coup among any segment of political elites that was approaching anywhere close enough to actually allow Bolsonaro to engage in the undemocratic actions, which he otherwise would, I suspect, have been completely willing to engage in.
America, while we're on elites in Brazil, can you also chime in, because then you talked about two of the main potential coup constituency actors. So how did this play out again among churches, where your research has shown that evangelical base has bought into Bolsonaro not as a military warrior, but as a cultural warrior? And we know that it contributed to his rise. How did it play out in the election's aftermath? Because I know they voted for him, but how did it play out after?
Yeah, how did it play out in the aftermath? You're asking about, sorry, the aftermath of 2018 or 2022?
2022, like in the last few weeks, like, and it might be too early to know, but I mean.
Yeah. So the amazing thing about Brazilian politics is that losers are really generally willing to consent. In part, I mean, in part because, I mean, there's a lot of endogeneity and self-interest in losers' willingness to consent. So we find the Bishop of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which has for a decade been one of the strongest critics of the left of the PT. The bishop of the church, that Jim said, was now talking about forgiving Lula, and talking about how maybe this is what God intended for Lula to win. Why does he want? I mean, I could tell you. Yeah. Maybe it is driven. This is driven entirely by sincere religious conviction. I don't want to discard the possibility that this is entirely about sincere religious conviction. I can also tell you that the Bishop of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God can get certain perks from being allied with whoever wins elections, that he would not have access to if he spent the next 4 years in enmity with Lula.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, as we're thinking about these alignments that coalesce for, I mean, for democracy, it's interesting what self-interest plays out, right? I mean, where, you know, I mean.
Yeah, I think one of the things about Brazilian politics is the fragmented nature of it has meant that everything requires coalitions, which provides a lot of reason for self-interested losers' consent, because a loser can change their own fate by aligning themselves with the winner.
Yeah, and even with the growing, you know, tendency of, you know, politics to be kind of bifurcated around, you know, pro and anti-petismo, that, you know, you still have incentives to play ball.
Yep. Yeah, and I would say actually polarization has changed that to some extent. Bolsonaro is not a very agreeable person. He's just not. I mean, I think at a personal level, he's kind of quarrelsome, querulous. He wasn't a person who played ball even when he was a deputy for decades. He didn't play ball with others. So it was always a little odd to have him in the presidency, because he wasn't a typical Brazilian politician in that way. And I think he brought a little bit of that lack of interest in negotiation and compromise into his take on the job. But yeah, I would say that there's enough of that impulse in much of the rest of Brazilian politics that impulse does persist among many members of the elite.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions from Jennifer Sir and Alicia Holland. Jennifer is asking, at the risk of asking you to predict, what do we think will happen to Bolsonaro now that he has lost the election? He doesn't have a party. It sounds like some of his support base will side with Lula. So what happens to him now?
Well, I don't feel qualified to entirely to predict here, but I can tell you that what Brazilian pundits that I talk with are talking about is Bolsonarismo sem Bolsonaro, which I think seems like it's likely to be the most, that's where I would predict things going. The style of politics that Bolsonaro has introduced is not going anywhere. And again, this is a style of politics that's much less oriented towards compromise, much more polarized than politics has traditionally been. And the sort of like ideological right, the coalescence of an ideological right is pretty much a new thing in Brazilian politics. And Bolsonaro helped to catalyze something that was already building, but in a sort of a somewhat inchoate until Bolsonaro really helped to catalyze that formation. So it seems clear that an ideological right is not going anywhere. And this, what we would call a new right in Brazilian politics. What's going to happen to Bolsonaro himself? Bolsonaro at the moment is keeping a position within the Liberal Party. So he was not able to get himself elected, but he had long coattails. So his party did better than he did, at least in the sense that, well, he ultimately, 49.2% of the vote is not bad, but it's not enough to win you the presidency, sadly. So sadly for him. Yeah, so his party ended up doing really very well. And his party is going to give him a sort of a standing position that enables him to have access to party lawyers and public funding. So is he going to run again? Entirely possible. For the moment, what's clear is that the movement that he catalyzed is here to stay. And will he be coming back and running again in some other election? I mean, he could certainly get elected as a deputy and probably as a senator. from the state of Rio de Janeiro, if he wanted to, he could certainly come back into Congress in 2 years or 4 years, rather. He could probably win a lower level majoritarian election. It's not clear, but he might well. So he may well have future plans to run for office. He is certainly taking advantage of party perks right now during his period out of office, or will be taking the period out of office starting January 1st.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I like what America was just saying about, I mean, Bolsonarismo without Bolsonaro is something we're seeing in a lot of countries where, as she talked about the new right, you know, where we've got this growing, it used to be to predict voting, you know, if there were issues, there's probably going to be something about the economy or something about, you know, rule of law and, you know, Mano Duro type stuff. And now this is a new thing. And the challenge with these social warrior and then just kind of general anti, you know, cultural attachments is they're hard to compromise on. You know, it's hard to draw what the middle position is on these issues. And so that then ends up locking in a lot of things. And it's a different form of polarization we have to worry about.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Alicia and one coming up from Raul Sanchez Uribarri. Alicia says, continuing on elites, I was wondering if you guys can say more about how competition between elites and particularly infighting within factions around populist leaders affect the willingness to speak out in favor of democratic norms and institutions. Like what, if any, are the factions within Morena that will speak out against AMLO's electoral reforms?
So it's probably my turn to go first. So yeah, so this is the challenge is there's going to be groups of people who have incentives to speak out for one of a couple of reasons. Obviously, there's the sincere believers that democracy really should work. There's also the instrumental ones who want to have a turn being in charge. And I think that's with AMLO where we have to kind of watch the rubber hit the road as he seems to be Teflon. Where it doesn't do no matter what he does, he's going to be at 60% approval rating, no matter what. And the question then becomes if he can deliver the Morena base to whomever he points it to, it's the Trump problem again, right? I mean, you can know that the candidates will lose in the general and still have to nominate the undemocratic ones because the base will. And so I think that's the difficulty ends up being that the ability to stand up to a leader is then endogenous to their underlying popularity and their underlying support inside their base. And I think that's the challenge, which is a nice way of not answering the question because I keep actively hoping that I'm going to see who in Morena is going to do it and keep waiting sadly for that to happen.
Great, thanks, Matt. Amy?
I'm not able to speculate on this, honestly. I'm not enough of a follower of Mexican politics to be able to speculate on who within Morena can do this. Obviously, this is the question. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. Sorry, Alicia.
Alicia, very quickly, do you want to follow up on the mic?
Oh, sure. I just wanted to ask you, Matt, whether you think that the public can distinguish between those two factions of true versus instrumental believers and whether that affects this kind of broader argument that you're making that it's really the only the opposition that speaks out in favor of democratic norms.
So my guess is the public's pretty bad at it because I don't think the public pays that much attention. And at the end of the day, I don't really care why they're standing up for democracy. I just want them to stand. But it is just, you know, we need somebody to be willing to acknowledge the possibility that their side is wrong. And I was recently watching, thinking back to the American case, because it was so salient this last year with the anniversary of Watergate. And just thinking about, you know, as watching Barry Goldwater standing on TV defending the president for a year. And, you know, because he was from his party and saying there's no smoking gun, there's no smoking gun. Eventually he was convinced and that when, you know, there was a tape recording of the president ordering a cover up. And so but I think for most of the public, they can't make that distinction very well. And then the damage is done if everyone's been saying this is normal and this is how the game is played. So I don't know.
Great. Excellent. Raul, I think I'm going to ask you to turn on your mic and frame your question. You have several points in there, and probably best if you, I don't know if you're able to turn on your mic. I'm happy to read your question. Raul? Okay, no worries. Thank you. Oh, yes, of course, you are at, it's late out in Australia. Great point, says Raul. One could say that a similar transformation happens in legal discourse and judicial behavior and processes of democratic deterioration. It's not only a question of whether judges side with democracy or rule of law or the leader, but rather endorse different interpretations of what protecting the Constitution and upholding the rule of law means. This also has effects on public support for the courts and judicial legitimacy. The erosion of judicial legitimacy is not absolute. Rulers' supporters will be happy to endorse constitutional interpretations that favor their leader and would be happy to accept the ruler's discourse that the court is acting correctly or the opposite. It would be great to hear your thoughts regarding implications for public support, not only for leaders, incumbents, but also for accountability institutions such as courts throughout the process of democratic decline. I would like to take on this one first.
I can briefly say something that I think is a great point. I don't have any particular insight, but I mean, I think you've sort of touched on one of the major ways, one of the major mechanisms for democratic erosion is that systems of checks and balances that people are used to thinking of as systems of checks and balances increasingly no longer actually serve the democratic checking and balancing function that they're supposed to. And it's very hard for citizens to recognize this. So, I mean, continuing on this metaphor of democratic erosion, I suppose erosion happens faster if there is erosion along multiple faces of a wall or something like that. This is additive and multiplicative in some way. And yeah, I don't have any insight. I think it's a really good point.
Yeah, I agree with it. It's a good point. And we've seen it play out in lots of countries where, I mean, classically Gibson said, to know courts is to love them, because you think about them in these, these abstract kind of impartial terms. And now, the Supreme Court of Brazil was perceived at various points as potentially a partisan body. The Supreme Court of the United States, partisan body. Supreme Court of Venezuela, clearly a partisan body. And when that's been perceived that way, its ability to act as an effective check will be further undermined, because again, it's now a political football. And so I think that insight's absolutely right.
Right. Thank you so much. We have 2 minutes for questions from any of the online or remote audiences. Otherwise, I'd let Amy, Erica, and Matt offer some closing thoughts.
I was going to say, Matt had a question for me via email, and I don't think we ever got to it. Did we, Matt?
I don't think so, but I have to remind myself what my question was.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I said, oh, well, that's a good point. We should talk about that. But I mean, here we are at 2:58 p.m. or 3:58 p.m. where you all are. We don't need to get to it unless Matt has really quickly.
I think we caught most of it. So I'd asked her about, why the polarization's not spiraled along the truckers. And so I think I think what's been fascinating, this has been the relief in both the United States and Brazil, is then some colleagues and I were talking about this on Saturday, that I spent my lead up to the United States election, lead up to the Brazilian election, kind of imagining worst case scenarios, and the press talking about worst case scenarios and armed poll watchers and whatever it was. And there seems to have been something that went on where people seem to have liked the rule of law and liked institutions more than we were worried they did. Mm-hmm. And, I don't know if it's just the press coverage was overly hyped or what, but I think both of America and my papers are fairly pessimistic.
Mhm.
And so I like getting the naive reminder that there are still reservoirs of support for democracy.
Yeah,
And
and
for-
also that there does seem to be something thermostatic about support for democracy. That, I mean, a few different people have pointed this out, but this is not a new idea on my part. But yeah, there is something thermostatic where at moments of democratic decline, especially if sufficient portions of the media and the elites rally to say this is a problem, there will be a thermostatic response, which is a really optimistic way to end this session, isn't it?
Unexpected, but there is the sense of voters coming back from the brink. When things seem to be kind of moving in a direction of erosion, there's some level of sobering up that brings it back and gives a bit more breathing space. Certainly is the case in Brazil, and that was my observation about last week's elections in the US. So let's hope we remain in that realm of the reversible. Thank you very much. This has been a fantastic panel. Thank you, everybody attending this conversation. And I'll invite you to stay a few minutes afterwards. From Quito, good afternoon, everyone. And we will see you in Charlemos 2023. Have a good time, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.